Hi everybody, welcome back to Mostly Old Parts. In today's episode we get to do something that's not a whole lot of fun. We get to replace a starter on a big block Mopar with headers. So here's what we got. It's way down in there, and I'm going to show you. I made a good decision to put a mini starter on this a long time ago. You don't have to take the headers off in this case. Basically, we're going to cut the steering column out, and it's only 7 bolts and a roll pin to take it out, as opposed to draining the entire cooling system, jacking the motor up, taking the headers off, taking the starter out, blah blah blah. So anyway, a couple of things about my car that are a little different than some of y'all's, or some of yours, depending on what part of the country you're in. This car has got a 4-speed in it, manual transmission with a Lakewood bell housing, which requires a little extra hardware to bolt the starter on with the smaller diameter 10.5-inch clutch and flywheel. And I'll show you how that all goes together. And also I'll show you the pieces necessary to put the starter on with that, in case when you order your Lakewood bell housing, those don't come with it. So anyway, stay tuned. The first thing we're going to do is knock this steering column out of here. Okay, on these B-body Mopars, there is a coupler right here. You can see where I've got my finger. And in that coupler is a roll pin. And if you look, there's a hole right here where the roll pin is. Now, before I even jack the car up, I like to turn the wheels so they're straight, and that roll pin is straight up and down. The reason I do this before I jack the car up, if the front wheels are off the ground, especially if it's a manual steering car like this one is, that shaft will have a tendency to want to turn over as you're striking it with a hammer and punch to get the roll pin out. If you leave the front wheels on the ground, that thing won't rotate on you near as bad, and the pin comes out a lot easier. Hang on, I'm going to knock that out of there. I'll be right back. Okay, so we got the roll pin knocked out. I just used a punch like this, just a little 5/16 diameter punch. Actually, that's a 1/4 inch. And of course a BFH, and just tap that out of there. I did have to take the spark plugs off of the rear 2 cylinders on this side to gain a little bit better access. But what we're going to do now is we're going to pull 3 nuts and 4 bolts out from underneath the column, or underneath the dashboard there on the column, and slide that back. And you can hear my shop dog Benji in the background saying hello to everybody. Say hi to Benji, everybody. Okay, everybody, say hi to Benji. He really wanted to say hi to everybody. Okay, so here we are underneath the dash, and we are going to take out these 4 bolts. You got one here, one here, one here, and one way up here. With those 4 nuts out of the way, now we're going to turn our attention to these, 4 bolts. Now we're going to turn our attention to these 3 nuts. You got one here on this side of the column, one here on this side of the column, and then you got one way up there. I don't know if you can see it or not. Anyway, these things run through a ceramic insulator. So be very, very careful not to break those insulators. They're expensive and hard to find. We're going to take those off and pull the column back. Okay, now with the column dropped down and pulled back slightly, you can put a pry bar right in here and separate these 2 pieces. This is the coupler from the steering gearbox. Sometimes they get a little crusty and it takes a little bit of work. This one's coming off pretty easy, and it just slides back like so. So this piece is separate from that piece. Now I'm going to get in the car and pull the column back just a little bit. I also want to take time to point out I have disconnected the negative post on the battery. Positive's still hooked up, no big deal, but I wanted to disconnect that because we're going to be working around that great big starter wire there. So let me pull the column back and we'll start accessing the starter. Alright, so here's the top of the starter, and we've got to get down here and undo the nut that goes to the solenoid, and then the main power, or the wire that goes to the solenoid and the main power feed. So that's what we're going to disconnect. It's not often I have to break out the metric tools to work on a 69 Plymouth, but with this Denso starter on it, it has metric fasteners. With this being a 12mm nut that holds the main wire from the battery down to the starter, and this being a 7mm, hence the little bitty wrench that holds the trigger wire for the solenoid. Got the wires off, pulled them to the side. There's the one for the solenoid, and here's the one, the main feed from the battery. So we got those out of the way. We're going to jack the car up, dive underneath it, and take the bolts loose that hold the starter on. Well, here we are under the car, and that bolt right there, I don't know if I can get the light on it right or not. There we go. This bolt right up here is the one we're after. There's a nut on the back side, so it's really not that hard to get to. I already took the top one out. It was just a breeze. You just reach down from the top side with a 5/8 socket and a 5/8 box end wrench on the other side and whiz it on out. And this one's going to come out here just momentarily. Alright, so I got the bolt off of the bottom. Now comes the fun part. We're going to do this from the top side because there's no room from the bottom. Reach down here. It's still coming up a little bit. Give me just a second here. There we go. And just like that, we got a starter out of a big block Mopar with headers. See that hole? You can't do that with a full-size starter, but you can do it with one of these little mini starters. And I believe this one was made by Power Master. I bought it used from a buddy of mine. And typically the starter itself doesn't go bad. What usually goes wrong with these little guys is when you pull this cover off, you're going to see there's a for lack of a better term, a horseshoe-shaped contact that is attached to this stud. And there's another one on the back side. Those things wear down to where they're absolutely paper thin, and then they don't make contact with the ring that's on the plunger. I'm going to take all this apart and show it to you and show you what we have found. Alright, so these little guys, the screws that hold everything together, just 7mm. Easy. Just like so. Just make sure you don't lose them. And typically, I use a regular ratchet, but trying to film a ratchet with two hands can be difficult, so I broke out the electric ratchet today. So anyway, this cover just pops off. Sometimes it'll stick a little bit. There's a gasket in there. We'll see the gasket here in a second. Be very careful you don't break that gasket. That's this guy right here. Back this away so we can see what we're doing. Take him off nice and easy so he doesn't break. Just like that. We'll set him to the side. Let's put our screws over there in our little magnetic tray. And here is the inner workings of this thing. Let's see if I can get this zoomed out a little bit so it's easier to see. This is a plunger. So I don't know if y'all know how a solenoid works or not, but there's a coil in here. See that? There's a coil in there that is just basically it's a wrapping of copper wire. And when you supply power from the Well, when you activate the coil, okay, 12 volt comes through this, and it sends energy through the windings in that, okay? This plunger is made out of steel, and you basically have an electromagnet in here that's formed by the coil, and it sucks that plunger down in where this copper ring makes contact with this horseshoe-shaped contact and this horseshoe-shaped contact. And if you look at this really close, let me get it up here where I can get some light on the subject. You see the wear on that? There's a groove. Here, I'll show you. This here, whoops, right here, is worn down just paper thin on both of the contacts. Okay, whoops, there's the other one. Trying to negotiate a camera and show you what's going on. Sometimes it can be fun. Anyway, so those are worn out bad. You can see where they've been arcing and sparking and not making contact. So we're going to get this little trusty kit. Here's that kit that I bought from our local NAPA store. Thank you, Curtis, for getting me the part number. It's nice to have parts guys who actually know how to be parts guys. Sometimes you find them. They're few and far between these days, as there's a lot of parts counter help who really doesn't have a clue what they're doing. And that's unfortunate because there's a lot of cars that need parts. Okay, so before we fix that, I want to show you here. If you've got a Lakewood bell housing on a big block Mopar, sometimes you'll buy the housing used, like I did, or sometimes they just don't supply the adapter kit that you have to have if you're running the 10.5-inch clutch. This car came standard with an 11-inch clutch, and if that was the case, I wouldn't need any of this stuff. But yeah, it's this piece here was hand built as per some drawings that I got from the fine folks at Holley. They no longer support these pieces individually in the aftermarket, but they were kind enough to show me a technical drawing of how it all went together, and I got out some 3/8 plate and I made a spacer and a little shim with a washer there, and that used to be a 7/16 bolt. I've got a pretty good drawing here. I'll show you. I'll include it later in the video of how I did that. But if you want to run the smaller flywheel in the Lakewood bell housing, you got to have this to bolt the starter on. I know they have 2 bolt patterns there for the starter, but believe me, only one of them works, and that's the one for the 11-inch clutch. Anyway, so we'll get back to that later. Right now, we're going to dig into this thing and pull these contacts off of here. Alright, so I got that loose, and I'm not going to take the whole thing apart yet because I wanted you all to see how it goes back together, or it comes apart, or whatever you need to know. The nut comes off. That uses a 14mm wrench. Then you've got a couple of washers here. These washers, let's see if I can get that in the picture there. There we go. They've got some flats on them, and that keeps them from spinning on you because there's like a D-shaped slot in the insulator that those washers have to fit into. After we do that, then we can pull this guy right out of here, and you'll see what we're up against. See how thin that contact has gotten over the years? It's worn away more than half of it on this side, and it's even worse on the other side. So we'll get that matched up to the one that's in this kit. I'm going to pull out the other side and we'll go from there. Alright, so here's the piece we took out, and here's the replacement piece, and you can see there's no wear on this guy, okay? But this guy's all chewed to hell. So we just take the bolt that we took out of there, put it through the new one, put this piece back on, like so. This little O-ring goes on to keep the water at bay, like so. It goes back through this little insulator piece, and then that whole mess gets loaded back into the solenoid. To go from, oops, get this thing focused here. That's better. Okay, so your positive wire from the battery hooks up here. When this coil is energized and sucks that down, the electricity makes contact through this ring to this side, where it is transferred down to the windings in the starter motor. So the solenoid performs two functions. It allows the electricity to pass to the starter motor, and it also extends the starter drive into the flywheel. All that when you turn the key or push the button or whatever you do to fire the thing up. Anyway, I'm going to put this thing back together, and we're going to test fire it here on the fender, make sure everything works before I put it back in the car. Okay, we're going to check and make sure this starter is actually working now before I take all the time to put it in the car. What I've done is I've hooked up the positive battery cable to both the the solenoid trigger point and to where the main battery cable hook up. And I've got a ground wire hooked up to the battery. I got my positive end of my jumper cables hooked up to my battery positive side, and now we're just going to do a quick, see that? It kicks out and it spins. Look at that. Okay, success. Alright, it's going back in. Hang on, I gotta turn off the music here, so y'all can hear me instead of the local radio station. Okay. Got it all back together here. Got the starter in, got the all wired up, bolted in. Like I said, I will have some information later on as to how that starter goes in with the special hardware for the Lakewood bell housing. On the front of the coupler, there's a notch right here at the front. You can't see it so much because it's dark down there, but there's a like a groove cut into the shaft that comes out of the steering box, and you want to line that notch up with that groove and get this thing pushed on all the way. Sometimes it takes a little tap with a hammer to get it to go all the way down so that you can line that pin up, and then you just drive the pin in and you're good to go. Okay, so everything's all tidied up. I got the steering column put back in, got the spark plug wires hooked back up, got the battery hooked back up. Steering column's all bolted in where it's supposed to be. Put it in neutral and see if this thing will start. A couple kicks just for good luck here. Fire's right up. And that's how you fix a starter. And yes, I do need to fix my tack. The power wire to it is broken. Anyway, that's how you replace a starter, or repair a starter actually, on a big block Mopar with headers. Now this would not work with a full-size starter, and it won't even work with that style Chrysler starter. It's just too big. But if you've got one of these little mini starters like from Hamburger, or in this case it's a Power Master, those little guys will fit right through there, and you don't have to drain the cooling system, you don't have to jack the motor up, nothing. You just slide the steering column back and unbolt the thing and take care of it. Okay, now I'm going to show you those photographs that I took of the hardware to bolt a starter to a Lakewood bell housing, and those parts are no longer available individually from the fine folks at Lakewood. After Holly bought them out, I guess you can only get them in the kit that is sold with the bell housing. So anyway, stay tuned for that, and I'll be back in a little bit.